I was walking home from the mall on Valentine's Day, feeling pretty good about my day of shopping and indulging in some much-needed me time. The sun was starting to set and the sky was a beautiful shade of pink and orange, so I decided to take the long way home to enjoy the peacefulness of the quiet streets and the beauty of the sky above me. I was 25 and excited to be starting a new job at the coffee shop next to my apartment. I had finally moved out of my parents' house and was beginning to feel like my life was going in the direction I wanted it to. I was listening to music through my earbuds, but had this nerve-wracking feeling that something was just off. It's like I could feel someone watching me. Almost like an invisible set of eyes were just locked directly to my every move. My heart began to race and my breathing became shallow as I quickened my pace, and I was desperate just to get home. I looked over my shoulder and, of course, there he was. My ex. The one who couldn't get over me and just wouldn't leave me alone. After we broke up almost a year before this, he did everything he could to convince me to take him back. At first, it was normal stuff like having flowers sent to my home or mailing me sweet letters in the mail. It was romantic and nice and kind of innocent even, but I didn't want to get back together with him, so I never responded to any of it. At this point, I hadn't seen or heard from him for a couple of months, and I thought that he had finally gotten the hint that it was over between us, but apparently not. He was walking about 10 feet behind me, and when I looked back at him, I could see this sort of sinister look in his eyes. He had always been a bit creepy, but this was some next-level stuff. He didn't say a word. He just sort of smiled this horribly disturbing smile. I tried to ignore him and keep walking, but he started following me more closely, getting closer and closer with each step. I turned a corner, hoping to lose him, but he was still there, and every step that I took, he took the same one only 5 feet behind me. I started to feel my panic set in. I'd always felt safe walking home alone, but now I felt like I was being hunted or stalked like someone's prey. I pulled out my phone, calling a friend, but she didn't answer. I tried calling my roommate, but still no answer. I was completely alone with no one to help me. I had called the police on him many times before, and the last time they just straight up told me not to call again about him unless it was a life or death situation, and I really didn't want to hear about that again. So I started to run, hoping to get to my apartment building before he caught up with me. I could hear him getting closer and closer with every step, and so close that I could even hear his heavy breathing. I was gasping for air and my heart was pounding in my chest, but I knew that I had to keep running. I finally made it to my building and ran inside, but he caught the door and followed me in. I could hear his footsteps echoing down the hall as I ran to my apartment and locked the door behind me once I was safely inside. I was okay. I wanted to scream and cry at the same time, but it wasn't over yet. I tried to calm myself down, but my mind was just racing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to call the police. I didn't want to make a scene, and I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I just wanted it all to be over. I wanted my ex to be one of those guys that just moves on when a relationship ends. My roommate found me curled up in a ball in front of the door and asked me what happened. Through tears and hyperventilation, I told her everything. She was horrified and told me that she didn't care what they said the last time that I had called and that she was calling the police, because being chased home by your psycho stalker ex is in fact life or death. Just as she got a hold of the dispatcher, we heard a noise outside the door. I froze, my heart racing. My roommate and I stared at each other with wide eyes, waiting, listening for any noise coming from outside my door. Was he trying to get inside? I grabbed a knife from the kitchen just in case. The noise stopped and I started to relax a little. My roommate was explaining everything to the dispatcher when suddenly it started again. This time it was louder. It was a loud banging noise, but the banging wasn't coming from the door. It was almost like he was stomping around outside the door, having a tantrum that he wasn't able to get inside. I'd never experienced that side of him, and I never knew that he was capable of doing something like this. Throughout our whole relationship, he seemed so normal. The reason we broke up was because he had cheated, and I felt like if he was willing to risk our whole relationship for one night with a random woman, then our relationship didn't mean much to him to begin with. You'd think that he would have been able to move on by the time this all happened. I crept up to the door, knife in hand, and peered through the peephole. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear someone breathing. It sounded like his mouth was pressed against the door like he wanted to hear it. I started to panic again, but my roommate tried her best to calm me down. The police told us to stay inside and keep the door locked until they arrived. They said it would only take around 10 minutes for them to get there. We sat on the floor and waited for the police. All the while, I could hear him still breathing on the other side of the door, and I knew that all he wanted was to get inside and do God knows what to me. Finally, the police got there, and they arrested my ex. He didn't put up a fight and went with them willingly. They took him away, and I was finally able to sort of breathe a sigh of relief, but unfortunately, this sort of fear and panic would stay with me for quite a long time. No matter how much I wanted to or how convenient it would be, I could never get myself to walk home alone again. I never forgot the feeling of being followed and hunted by someone who had supposedly loved me before. I was lucky to make it out alive, but the thought of what could have happened is something I still think about almost every day. I never thought that someone I once loved could turn into a monster. It's important to always trust your instincts. I learned that the hard way, and I hope that my story can serve as a warning to others. It serves as a reminder that sometimes love can just turn into an obsession, and that obsession can turn into something much more dangerous. I was so excited to start a new life in the city. My girlfriend and I had just moved into a small apartment, and I was eager to explore a place that I'd never been before. I got to the grocery store to pick up a few things, and as I was walking home, I was texting my girlfriend about all the cool things I came across on the walk and all the fun stuff that there was for us to do together around the city. I was so preoccupied with my phone that I didn't even realize that I'd gotten turned around. I don't know how I was stupid enough to not look where I was going, but I was just really excited to tell her about my day and everything I saw. After a while, I finally looked up and realized that I had no idea where I was. The streets were empty and the buildings appeared to look abandoned with their doors and windows boarded up. It kind of looked like something out of an apocalyptic video game, The Last of Us. I was starting to feel uneasy and honestly a little scared. This looked like nothing of the area that I was just walking in not too long ago. I looked at my phone's map and started making my way back in the right direction. I was around 4 miles from home still, and it was getting dark. As I was walking, I saw an old car with a taxi sign on top. It was starting to rain and the darkness was engulfing the streets around me, but I still hesitated for a second before getting in. It didn't look like an official taxi, and I'd seen way too many true crime shows to trust it, but I just wanted to get home, and the thought of being lost in this unfamiliar place was freaking me out way more than getting in the car. I knocked on the window and the driver rolled it down just a little crack, and it was enough for me to ask if he was able to take me where I needed to go. He didn't speak, just nodded a yes in my direction. He unlocked the doors and I got in and told him to drop me off at the gas station near my apartment building, and I gave him the address. The driver started the engine and we were off. I still had my Maps app open and glanced at it every so often to make sure that we were going in the right direction. Only the further we drove, I noticed that we had started going in the opposite direction of my apartment. I started to get nervous and asked the driver if he could take me home or even just let me out so I could find another ride, but he didn't say a word, and instead just kept driving. I started to feel panic set in as the car took me further away from my home. I demanded that the driver let me out, and he just sort of chuckled to himself. I tried to open the door, but it was locked and didn't have a button to unlock it. It was one of those locks where when the car is locked, it retracts into the door and you can't pull it up to unlock it. And I was trapped. I started to feel a cold sweat on my skin as the fear that I was feeling began to fill every inch of my body. The driver drove for what felt like forever, taking me deeper into the outskirts of the city down its darkest, deserted streets. In reality, we probably only drove for around 30 minutes, but the panic and fear that I was feeling in that car made every second feel like hours. The rain was coming down harder and harder, and I could feel the driver's eyes on me through the rearview mirror. He was watching me closely, and it was making me even more afraid. I was trapped in that taxi with a stranger who seemed to have no intention of letting me go. The fear and desperation was overwhelming, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't think of a way out. Eventually, the taxi pulled off to the side of the road, and the driver turned to look at me. He was wearing a black hoodie, and I almost wanted to laugh for a second and remembered where I was and decided that that wouldn't be the best idea. I could see a sort of creepy smirk on his face as he spoke to me in a harsh voice. "Welcome to your final destination," he said, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what to do. I tried to reason with the driver to just let me go and there'd be no harm done, but he wouldn't listen. He just laughed as he got out of the car and walked towards the back door. I didn't even know what to think. I had no idea what he was going to do with me. The driver opened the back door and dragged me out of the car by my jacket. He threw me into the gutter, and I hit the ground hard. I was in pain, but I was still alive. I tried to get up and run, but he was fast and caught me, tackling me to the ground. He put a knife to my throat, and I was on the verge of tears, and I tried to scream, but nothing came out. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice shaking, and the driver just laughed, saying, "Why not?" I was terrified and I couldn't move. I could feel the cold metal of the knife against my skin. Finally, I was able to muster up a scream loud enough that somehow a group of people nearby were able to hear it. I heard footsteps coming from down the street, and thank God that they were getting closer. The man told me to shut up and press the knife harder against my skin. And just when I thought things were over for me, I heard a voice calling out in the distance. "Hey, what's going on here?" I looked down the street, and only about 50 feet away, a group of people were walking towards us. They were watching us, and I realized that the driver was beginning to get nervous. His hands began to shake, and he got off of me as fast as he could. He turned and ran away on foot, just leaving his car and me laying there on the street, reeling from what had just happened. The group ran towards me, and one of the guys helped me up and put pressure on the wound that I didn't even notice that I had on my neck. They called the police, and an ambulance took me to the hospital. I needed a few stitches for the laceration on my throat, but was otherwise physically okay. The police searched the vehicle and realized that it was stolen, and there was nothing in it to tie it to the person who had done that to me that night. Now, years later, another man was abducted in the same manner in that area, only this time, the man was caught and he was arrested. I was called in due to the correlation in the crime and was able to identify the man as the man who attacked me on that night, and thank God that he was charged and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He never admitted to kidnapping anyone else, but we knew that that was probably not true. I tried my best to get over it, but the emotional scars will always be there, along with the physical one on my neck. I'm so grateful to the people who saved me, and I'll never forget the fear and desperation that I felt in that taxi, but I'll also never forget the kindness and bravery of the strangers who risked their lives to help me and make sure that I was okay. From that day on, I made sure to always pay attention to my surroundings and never let my guard down again. I lived in Venice, California, and I was walking home from a friend's house late at night. I lived just a few blocks away, but I always felt nervous walking home alone at night. Venice has always been known for its kind of high crime rates and homeless population, and I always made sure to carry my pepper spray with me wherever I went. I had no intentions of becoming a victim in the city like the countless other women that I've heard of before, and everything seemed fine at first. The walk was short, and every now and then I'd pass another person and smile at them. It was late and I was nervous, but I tried my absolute best not to show it. I didn't want to seem vulnerable in any way, shape, or form. I was wearing an old backpack that I'd used in high school instead of carrying my purse to try to deter thieves, and I made sure to put on clothes that didn't show much of my body. There wasn't such a thing as being too careful to me, and as I was walking, I heard a man's raspy sort of smoker's voice behind me. "Excuse me, miss. Got any spare change?" I turned around to see what appeared to be a homeless man. His clothes were torn up with plenty of holes, and his eyes seemed to be wild. It almost seemed like his thoughts were wandering as he was talking. I just shook my head and told him that I didn't have any money and that I was sorry. But he didn't seem to appreciate that. "Come on, just a little bit." He persisted, his voice growing more aggressive. A pretty girl like you is bound to have at least a few dollars on her. I hated talking to strangers, let alone a person who was apparently as unpredictable as this guy seemed to be. I didn't want to deal with the situation any longer and decided ignoring his statement would be the best option. I didn't want to upset him any further or make things harder on myself by rejecting his request for money again, so I just whispered a quick, "I'm sorry," and started to walk faster away from him, trying to put as much distance between us as I possibly could. The man followed, throwing insults here and there and eventually resorting to making threats. "You rich girls always think you're better than us. You're gonna regret this. I can promise you that." I was scared, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I quickened my pace even more to the point where I was basically running away from the guy, but he was still following me and surprisingly keeping up with me pretty well. I started to hear him getting closer, and I was terrified that he was going to attack me or hurt me. I reached into my pocket and I grabbed my pepper spray, ready just in case. I turned around, I pointed it at the man and yelled as loud as I could, "Leave me alone!" I tried to sound brave, but it just came out as some little squeal. The homeless man just laughed in a way that gave my whole body chills. He took a step closer, and I aimed the pepper spray directly at his face. "Don't come any closer, please. I don't want to hurt you. Just leave me alone and I'll forget this ever happened," I warned, and my voice was shaking. But he didn't seem to listen. He just kept coming, and his eyes were just transfixed on me. I hadn't really used it before, but I squeezed the trigger, and a burst of pepper spray shot out, hitting him directly in the face. He screamed and buried his face in his hands as he stumbled backwards. I started to feel tears in my eyes as well, but I took that moment to run, and my feet pounded against the pavement as I raced back to my apartment. I locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I technically was safe now, but I just couldn't shake the fear that was beginning to creep over me. I knew that I couldn't let the homeless man's insults and threats get to me, but it was hard to ignore the fear that was beginning to gnaw at me, the fear that he would come back and try to hurt me again. I spent the rest of the night lying in bed, just sort of staring at the ceiling. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the man was just outside, waiting for me. Now I knew that I should have called the cops right then and there, but I've had issues in the past, and unless you're essentially being cooked alive, the cops' response time is just essentially next to never around here. Eventually, days turned into weeks, and I started to feel more confident in my life. I started to walk home alone again, and I didn't see that guy anywhere. I thought that maybe he had moved to another area, and that maybe I was safe now, but I was wrong. One night, as I was walking home from work, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around, and there he was again, his eyes seemingly blazing with anger, and it was like that entire night was playing over again in my mind, and it was clear that he'd not moved on from it at all. "You think you can get away from me?" he yelled, and he started to lunge towards me. I let out a scream, reaching for my pepper spray, but it wasn't there, and I suddenly remembered setting it on the kitchen counter and forgetting to grab it before I went out for the day. I turned to run, but he was too fast. He grabbed me, his fingers digging into my skin. I screamed, fighting against him, but he was too strong and his grip was unrelenting. I was screaming, punching, kicking, anything to get the man to let me go, but nothing was working. And just when I was starting to lose hope of escaping unharmed, I see a police car pull up and 2 officers jump out, rushing towards us. The homeless man released me, and I stumbled backwards as my knees buckled underneath me. The officers were able to apprehend him, taking him into custody, and I was finally safe. I sobbed as the officer told me that I would have to make a formal statement, and after that night, I never walked home alone again. I was too traumatized by what had happened. I never forgot that fear, and it stayed with me, a sort of constant reminder of what could happen when you aren't cautious enough of your surroundings or really the area that you're living in. Sometimes it's just not safe enough to walk home on your own, and there's nothing you can really do about it. The man was charged but received no jail time. I guess the jails in my area were already overpopulated and his charge wasn't a serious one, so they informed me that they had to let him free. It didn't make me feel any safer though. Hopefully I'm the last person he ever does that to, and no one else has to feel the same fear at the hands of that man.
Our official merch store is finally here. If you want to support more of our channel, check out our merch shop. The link is in the description down below. See you on the next video.